Hi everyone, welcome back to Byte Marx. I'm Emilio, pronouns he, him, and I'm joined today by a very special guest. Say hello, Thersites the Historian.
Hi everyone, I'm Thersites the Historian,
You know, it's
and
it's
all right.
amazing. It's amazing to me. I've listened to a lot of your videos. I'm a big fan of your channel. It's amazing to me how similar all of those introductions are. I always feel like I do the introduction on these differently, but you have a remarkable cadence. But yes, welcome to Thersites.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I've never really thought too much about the intros on my live streams, especially. I just kind of start, so I don't really know if I have a real intro or if it just kind of happens that way.
Yeah, we are. Do you consider what you do to be a podcast, or are you? Because a lot of your stuff is very podcasty, but you still do more prepared video essays, I guess.
Yeah, no, I don't I actually don't know exactly what the definition of a podcast is as compared with just a YouTube video.
Yeah,
I mean, more or less, I don't really think too much about categories when I'm making content. I just kind of make things I'm interested in, and that's my strategy for the whole channel. It always has been. If I'm interested in something,
well,
I research on it and just start talking about it. That's about it. There's not really a lot of I don't really spend too much time thinking about format. That's not really been something that I've done much.
genre convention be damned. I think it's always important to make stuff that you're interested in. My golden rule for video production is never make a video that you aren't absolutely 100% actually interested in watching. So before we get too far down a tangent about the trials and tribulations of being a YouTube creator, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience and just tell them about your channel?
So, my channel is mostly about history. I do a variety of different topics. By training, I'm an ancient historian. I actually have a PhD in Greek history. So, I mean, that kind of stuff comes up quite a bit on my channel, but I guess I'm fairly versatile. I can do just about any period. I do a lot of live streams every week. I do one on Sundays, usually with my friend Sean, and we do a lot of military stuff on that one. And then when I do my lecture videos, I do all kinds of different topics. So, I don't know. I've covered everything from very, very recent stuff to I think we just did a few weeks ago. We did a review of the first year of Biden's presidency, and I do things like that. And I've also covered things, as I say, the Minoans and Mycenaeans. So I've done everything from the Bronze Age to the present. And over the time I've been working on this channel, I've been filling in the gaps steadily and covering different topics and trying to expand the reach of what I do more and also go back and do more detail. A couple of my ongoing series are, I do one where I'm looking at all of the different Byzantine emperors. And right now I'm about to move on to Michael IV the Paphlagonian. And I also have a series called Romans of Renown, where I look at mostly somewhat obscure Roman figures and basically try to give many biographies of them and then contextualize it in their period. So
Yeah,
mostly
it's very comprehensive stuff. I noticed, which this is kind of the outlier. I noticed that a while back you made some videos about video games. Are you much of a
yeah,
gamer?
I am. I mostly am a console gamer. Mostly play on Xbox One these days, but I got my start on the Genesis,
Oh yeah,
and
it's good. That's a good system.
that's still something I go back to. And I love Genesis, Super Nintendo. As a kid, I had a Sega CD, a 32X, and a Saturn, which I guess are
Whoa.
systems that a lot of people I know have never played. So when people would come over to my place, they'd be like, "What the fuck is that?" And then show
Oh
them
yeah.
Panzer Dragoon or whatever.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how back in the olden days there really just were separate ecosystems for video games, and nowadays, except for maybe a couple of exceptions, most people can play most games on some kind of device that they have. People can even play Fortnite on a phone nowadays, which if you had told like child me that would be possible, I think I would have just not believed you. Well, first I would have asked you what a phone was.
Yes, same. I remember recently my two sisters also play games. They're younger than I am, but they each have a PS4, and I remember they were asking about some games like, well, you probably can't play it on Xbox, and everything they named, like, yeah, that's available. So
they're probably a little bit too young to really understand that there used to be a console war, but nowadays it's more of a console cold war in some respects.
And I think a lot of it boils down to, which online service do you prefer, which controller do you like better?
Yeah, I actually kind of like Xbox controllers because I have very long fingers, and the big meaty controller is actually ideal for my hands.
Same here, actually.
Yeah, PlayStation, I have nothing against it, but the controller has always felt awkward to use. It's kind of funny, we were talking about this earlier. You are a gamer to quite a degree. I don't think you'd be on a gaming podcast if you weren't. And something that comes up often when I talk about video games is that, and I did an episode about this about Call of Duty with another YouTuber. We talked about sort of like the historicity of Call of Duty games and how they're like crazy full of propaganda and stuff like that, but it's very subtle. And often I think a lot of people nowadays, especially young people, get their history from video games. Because when I was growing up, people would get their history from TV and movies, which is why a lot of people still kind of have really weird ideas about like Scotland because of Braveheart.
Yeah.
Arguably to an extent Rome because of movies like Gladiator and what was the other big one? Well, I guess Ben-Hur is a little bit too old, but you know what I mean, right? Like every generation has a media system that delivers to them often not correct ideas about history, and then when you're a kid you just eat all of this up. It's everything is very black and white, and then if you actually study history to any degree, I don't have formal history training, but I specifically went out of my way to take history in high school because I liked history a lot, and I learned a lot more in that like just history class than I ever did playing any kind of video game. But that brings us to today's topic, and you wanted to talk about how to read history, how to read video games for historical information.
So this has been something I've been kind of working on the side, and what I'm talking about with this is when you're playing a game, how can you read it to learn about the world that produced the game?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I think about this as an ancient historian because in ancient history we have a pretty limited number of sources, and a lot of times we have to take something and try to extract as much as possible from it. I mean, the amount of source critique that you do as an ancient historian is much, much greater than in a modern period where you have a lot to choose from. So, for instance, if you were to look at a random game on Sega Genesis, say a beat 'em up, what can you determine from that about the society that produces this game?
Okay.
What kind of values are embedded here?
Well,
and that's... Yeah.
I was going to make a joke about Battletoads, but yeah, no, that is a... it's just like, their society is constantly beset by like random street thugs that can only be beaten by fighting them in small groups of like 5 at a time, and also you should hit like dustbins to eat chicken.
Exactly, and when you knock over a garbage can, there's a roast chicken there. It's great.
Yeah, but we'll leave that for future historians in like the year 3000. So reading history, I think that's really interesting because you bring up this point about ancient societies. Like we really don't have a lot from ancient societies. I often think it's kind of a miracle that we know as much as we do. And I guess that's really interesting because video games are kind of, in a way, incredibly disposable. One of the common problems, I think, with video games is that history is very ephemeral in a video gaming landscape, right? How many video games are we going to lose forever because the version of that game is not going to be supported on a modern system? It's maybe, it's going to be forgotten to an arcade, cabinet or like a ROM on someone's shelf. and we're just never going to know that it existed, or even that, you know, it was there. And in a way, the gaming industry kind of doesn't want you to know the history. It doesn't want you to have a history because, well, number one, that stops you from buying the next new shiny Call of Duty or whatever, right? Like, just forget about the previous games, play this new game.
Right.
But on the other hand, I think there is this impetus in gaming to kind of like forget the past. You know, like, don't worry about what happened. Don't take any lessons from the past. Just keep moving forward. And that's kind of why we're in such a big problem, you know, with the current gaming industry. But yeah, am I right with that kind of read?
I think so. And there's also, I mean, there also are a few companies, Nintendo, who are really against preserving ROMs for the purpose of emulation and preserving gaming history.
Yeah, that's always struck me as really strange, because I was always under the impression that the Japanese, barring some war crimes in World War II, were generally very keen on historical preservation. So the idea that Nintendo would deliberately obfuscate, or in some cases just outright deny people the ability to play their old games, that seems kind of weird to me.
Also, I guess that we also have to remember, you know, the gaming industry is a part of a larger capitalist system. So, I mean, obviously they're trying to squeeze every last dime out of it. And with Nintendo, it goes to the point of trying to take games that are now 35 years old and continuing to make profit off of them. Which at a certain point is like, you've made all the money you're going to make off this old game. Give up.
Yeah.
If you're not going to make a new version of it, just let the old ones be free. Who's going to pay for a game that was programmed in 1985 at this point?
Yeah, that's a good point, you know, because I think a good way to do it would be that whenever the new version of a game comes out, like say the new Zelda game, they make like maybe 2 or 3 Zelda games back. They just make that one free. They just like open release it or whatever. Because I think that would keep interest sustained, because there's a lot of time between Zelda games, you know. And a lot of people play games out of nostalgia, but I don't think nostalgia is enough to like make you pay $60 or, you know, a very old, like The Legend of Zelda 2 or whatever, you know. So
yeah, I mean, or you could do it where if you have your new game, then you put the older game or one or more of them as an unlockable.
Oh yeah, that would also be a great idea. I think they did that with the new Doom. I think you can just play the original Doom inside the new Doom, or one of the new Dooms. So
yeah, they've been doing that for a while with Doom.
Doom 3 BFG edition, you have Doom 1 and 2 in it. And I think the new one, you're right, the 2016 Doom also has the original.
Maybe it's just because I think id is still a little bit more, I'm not going to say anti-corporatist, because they are, you know, a corporation. They're owned by Bethesda, which is one of the most, you know, sort of corporate companies that you can get. But I do think maybe there's still a culture at like id Software. It's like, hey, you know, we are part of a legacy. We are part of like a pioneering, you know, impetus in FPS design, and we don't want people to forget that. So we're gonna, you know, just keep giving you the games. And also, Doom is still a very eminently playable game.
Yeah, it's still a great game even after all these years. But speaking of like the anti-corporate messaging in games, I mean, I've noticed a lot of games, even though all of them are made by companies, a lot of them do poke fun at corporations. You know, the BioShock series, and especially the Outer Worlds from a few years ago.
Well, I think to some extent, like, I know there's always this big tradition in JRPGs of using, when they're not using God and other weird, you know, mystical entities as villains, they often tend to use corporations as villains. I think like in a lot of the Final Fantasy games, especially some of the more recent ones, a lot of the themes like, oh yeah, Final Fantasy, the remake, the one with Cloud. I don't play the Final Fantasy games, but that one, the big villain, that one is a company.
Shinra Corporation.
Yeah, I think partially, you know, video game designers are still people who are interested in making art, and you can tell when a game is more of a cash grab than it is an artistic expression. Like the original BioShock, the people in that game, also plug for the channel, we have an episode on the original BioShock. The people who made that game wanted to say something. Now they wanted to do this very, maybe too unsubtle depiction of sort of Randian philosophy. And great, right. It was awesome. And they had something to say. However, you know, gaming, I think, is unique in the sense that it is both art form and commodity at the same time. Where there is this explicit assumption that because a game has to be played, it has to have ideas about mechanics or something that makes it, more of a commodity than just looking at a piece of, there's a different experience between playing a video game, no matter how good or artistic that game is, and say looking at a Renoir in a gallery, right?
Right.
And that blurring of the line, I think, is partially one of the reasons why even games that are very anti-capitalist or have anti-capitalist messaging still are produced by these big corporations. Because, most of the time game development is still a very difficult thing to do. It's very hard to make a game. It's getting better, you still have indie developers that can make very interesting games, but for the most part, you need a lot of money to make a video game, especially a video game that's going to reach a big audience.
Right, and be up to date on the mechanics and all that, because gamers can be pretty impatient when you're using outdated, say, menus that take forever to navigate, or if the graphics aren't up to snuff compared to other games. I mean, a lot of gamers will bail.
Yeah,
so,
I think it comes back almost in a way to that sense of like gaming history is a really complicated thing. Because on the one hand, gamers are very fickle and they do kind of have an intuitive understanding of what bad design decisions might be. But on the other hand, they kind of don't remember anything long term. How many times have you seen like a game that comes out? Like this happens a lot with the Battlefield series. Speaking about like understanding history, because every time a new Battlefield game gets released, there is always a wave of people who talk about how the previous Battlefield game was an underrated like game and it was really good, and how the current Battlefield game sucks and how the next Battlefield game will be great. And this happens, like I've watched this consistently for several Battlefield games now, where it's just, oh yeah, everyone's like, oh yeah, this current game sucks, the next game is going to be better, the previous game was pretty good. And that I guess, is just because gaming history is very complicated. And also maybe just because gamers tend to be younger, especially nowadays. Gamers are a lot more young than maybe they used to be. It's much more accessible, which is a good thing. And maybe that makes it harder for these people to really, conceptualize a history. Because if you're like playing Fortnite, then you are as far removed from playing Doom as, Cleopatra was from the pyramids, in a very sort of stretched kind of way.
No, you're right. Yeah, I remember also I've heard that there's a new term now used by younger gamers. They describe games like Doom that don't have RPG elements, or more specifically aren't online or interactive with their players. They call them boomer shooters.
Yeah, I've heard
as
that
if there were that many boomers playing FPS games, but
I think if I'm not mistaken, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but if I'm not mistaken, there's also kind of like a double play on the boomer shooter, because oftentimes, in those kinds of games, there is a great emphasis on, things like explosion physics and rocket jumping and stuff like that. There's no way in hell you're going to be rocket jumping in a Battlefield, in a Call of Duty game, So whereas in a game like Quake or Doom, you can, rocket jump, and maybe it is a clever pun, or maybe they just think of anyone over the age of like 20 as a boomer. I don't know.
Yeah, it was basically it's more them using the word boomer to mean old person, even though it's actually, a generational term. But yeah, I don't think they'd be clever enough to pull that off, the person I'm thinking about, at least. But yeah, with the shooters especially, I remember there's also a big difference in perspective between gamers who grew up in my period versus some of the people who only play online. Because I know when one time I was making a comment somewhere on a video that I'll never play Black Ops 4, or was it 3 or 4, the one that doesn't have any single player campaign.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody was making fun of me, like, what do you mean? Who gives a shit about the single player campaign? Who actually plays those? And then I started looking into it, and apparently it is pretty rare now when you have new Call of Duties or Battlefields that people actually play the single player. And even some of my friends, I'll ask them if I go to their place and I see their game, I'll be like, oh, so how's the campaign? I don't know. Never played it.
It's at the same, on the one hand, it's incredibly shocking, but on the other hand, I kind of actually get where they're coming from, right? Because when I grew up playing FPS games, like one of my favorite FPS games of all time is Half-Life. And that game is basically one just big, long story, right? I never knew anyone who actually played the multiplayer of Half-Life. Whenever I would talk to people about Half-Life, it would always be, here's this great story. I think one of the issues that has kind of sprung up is that game companies know that, especially with games like Call of Duty, a lot of their money is going to be made in a multiplayer sense, because you can sell that multiplayer experience almost indefinitely, right? But a person can only really play a single-player story a handful of times, maybe like once or twice, or for a couple of people, maybe even more than that. But in terms of the profit incentives, you really want to get people to play your FPS shooter and just keep playing it on multiplayer and buying skins. And I remember when skins used to be you get them for doing stuff in the game. Not to date myself too much, but there is this tendency, I think, for companies to spend more and more of their money on developing their multiplayer experiences, because they know that's where more and more of the money is going to be. And to circle this back to sort of the difficulties of history, as younger gamers grow up playing games, they don't have an idea of what games used to be like. On the one hand, this is good because they don't know all the jank that you and I probably would have to put up with. But on the other hand, they don't know that a game can just come out in a finished state and you can play the whole thing from start to finish and never have to spend any more money. That is increasingly becoming an alien idea, I think, in their minds.
Yes, and that's one thing that I will always miss, is the idea that a game is the way it's supposed to be from the time it's released. That, and there aren't any DLC, well, not so much DLC, but things that you can spend money on. Like, that's one reason I can't really enjoy the NBA 2K games, because I enjoy basketball games, but it's constantly trying to get you to spend money on a game you've already purchased.
Yeah. Sports games are unfortunately particularly emblematic of this issue, because they get more expensive every year, and seemingly the quality of the game that you get is less and less. It's diminished. The graphics might be a little bit shinier, but the gameplay is still fundamentally the same. There are very few major shakeups. Eventually, you kind of start to be thinking, why is this like an annualized franchise? Why are they making a new basketball game every year instead of maybe like once every 5 years or once every 10 years, Because, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't really feel like there's all that much to be gained by moving from one basketball system to the next. You're just playing you're playing basketball. So it can't change all that much,
I guess with a lot of sports, it is hard to get the physics exactly right. And even today, after, 30 years of making basketball simulations, there are times where I will see things happen in these games and I'll be like, that is not physically possible.
Out of interest,
no way that would ever happen.
Out of interest, do you play basketball?
A little bit, yeah.
So I am quite curious, because I always get this asked of me, because I'm a fencer, and I often complain about the sword fighting in video games. Why do you play basketball video games exactly? What's the appeal for you?
Well, I enjoy watching the NBA, and so I like to play the games. I always have. I also like to do the season simulations, dynasty simulations, and then the career modes they've had in the more recent games over the last 10 years or so are pretty cool too. So there are times when, because I've watched enough basketball, I've played some, mostly like pickup games, but there are times where they'll make the shooting mechanics in a game so complicated that you have really good shooters airballing consistently, unless you know exactly how you're supposed to shoot in this game. And the fact of the matter is, shooting a basketball is not that hard. In real life, I could go out and make shots way easier than I can in a lot of these games.
It's kind of funny.
It's not close, because shooting's like the one thing in basketball I'm pretty good at. But there's a problem if I can easily go outside to a park and knock down a three-pointer, and then I can't do it in a game. That's not quite right. Something's off there.
Yeah, that's like completely backwards, because usually it's supposed to be that, doing it in the game is easy, but doing it in real life is hard.
Yeah, and especially if I'm playing as a person who is a professional player and is many, many times better at basketball than I'll ever be, but yet in this game I cannot get them to do anything.
Yeah, that's always struck me as really odd, because like to borrow a comparable example, you can play a strategy game, and you can play a historical strategy game, and if you're a bad general, you you can make the kinds of mistakes that a bad general might in real life and get a whole bunch of troops killed and lose the battle and, yada, yada, yada. But if you're playing a game where you're meant to be playing a character who already has this experience, already knows how to do these things, these very basic things, the idea that you could fail at doing them is both alien from a narrative perspective, but completely required from a mechanical perspective. Because if you couldn't fail, if the character would just automatically, shoot the ball, or adjust if you push the wrong buttons or whatever, then you remove the element of the game. But it's less realistic because, LeBron James should know how to do this stuff. He's LeBron James.
Yeah, I think the way to do it is you penalize people for doing it wrong, but you try not to have, say, air balls. Because air balls are not that common. That's why if you watch basketball highlight videos, if somebody does airball a shot, it goes into the highlights. To make fun of the player and also to point out it's really not that common.
Basketball is not that common in South Africa. Our big sport is rugby, which is very similar to your American football. And we call what you would call soccer, we call that football over here. But
right.
Regardless, there are still plenty of sports games. There's sports games for things like cricket. I actually don't get that one. Like games like cricket and baseball, I feel like those would be very boring to play.
Yeah, I remember baseball games here were super popular in about the mid-90s, from the Genesis to the PlayStation 1. And I had friends, if I went over to their place, they would want to play triple play, and I'm like, I don't understand how baseball works, so I don't know how this is going to work.
Yeah, baseball and cricket are both categories of sport that are incredibly weird to me. I can understand lots of other sports like rugby, football. Those are derivatives of other kind of contact sports, things like wrestling and stuff like that. Basketball, football, to some extent I can get it, people kicking around the ball. But a game as needlessly convoluted as baseball or cricket, that is only a crazy society, could come up with something like that, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's also interesting to me how many stats are involved with something like baseball. And you end up having a lot of fans who, if it were any other endeavor of human activity, would not tolerate that level of statistical analysis, but they'll do it for baseball.
Yeah, I think that's called sabermetrics. Or, yeah, something like that. It is, yeah, it's really weird to me just how reducible, I think that's maybe kind of an issue, is just how reducible baseball is to just numbers. And maybe that's why they make baseball video games, because that's, from a programming perspective, kind of easy. But yeah, I do find that interesting. I've always had issues with video games and how they portray sword fighting. A lot of video games get it just completely wrong. But if they ever tried to really make a historical video game that really did have those kinds of accurate depictions of sword fighting or sword combat, I don't think it would be very fun to play. So video games are supposed to be things that, at least in my mind, they're supposed to be things that we would struggle to do in real life, or at least for the most part. There are some games that are a little bit different than that.
Right. I mean, there might be a game you could enjoy. Have you ever heard of the game Weapon Master, or was it Weapon Lord? It was on Genesis and Super Nintendo. I think that one is supposed to be somewhat realistic in terms of the sword fighting, but at the same time, it's incredibly complicated, and you have to know a lot of combos to really play.
Yeah, I think there is if that's the game that I'm thinking of, I do have some familiarity with it. I think the modern game that everyone talks about now is the game called Hellish Court, which bills itself as a very realistic game. But the simple truth of the matter is, a video game is a thing that is meant to be played. It's not like a sword fight, in real life, where there are stakes where you can get hurt, or if you're doing it for real, die. And the game is just not really going to be able to accurately replicate that until such time as we can get something like a Star Trek holodeck and plug ourselves into a VR simulation, where I'm not just looking goofy with this giant thing. I actually don't like VR. I get headaches, pretty bad ones, if I ever try to use VR goggles. I don't know if you have any experience with it.
I've only used it once. I was visiting Nashville and I had some friends who lived there, and we went to this arcade for Oculus or whatever it was called. We played some game where you defend an area against charging orcs with your bows, and I enjoyed it. I know my girlfriend didn't have as good of a time with it. It took her a little while to adjust to the headset and everything, but I got into it pretty quickly.
Maybe it's
But
just
that's
me.
only been a one-time thing.
Yeah, I've had some experience with VR sets. It always gives me terrible headaches. So maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm going to be left behind when the VR revolution kicks off. But yeah, it's weird. But we should circle back to history. The fun tangent, but we should circle back. So I think the question that I have is why should people care about history and sort of reading history from video games? Why do you think that should be important to them as gamers?
Well, you mean using games to learn about history, or using?
I mean, why should gamers have an
Okay.
understanding of sort of the history of their games and what the games can sort of tell them about the time that they grew up in? Why should we even like think about games like that? Shouldn't we just treat video games in a way like candy wrappers? Just chew the gum, spit it out, and move on to the next thing.
I mean, I think thinking about it historically does help you to better appreciate the time as a whole. So, one example that I use a lot, and this is something I actually use when I teach. If you're really looking to see something that is very much a product of its time, and which reflects the values that of the immediate time, especially in which it was produced, but also the last decade or so of filmmaking, sort of the political environment, Desert Strike for Sega Genesis very much wears
Oh yeah,
everything about itself on its sleeve. So I mean, you start off with the intro, you got that dun 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 dun. So I mean, there's this idea of if you have a military game, you have to have a kind of metal theme song. You get your helicopter just firing missiles endlessly. So it's very much like an 80s action thing where you just have explosions all over the place. And you get into the game. Well, also there's the intro where you fight the desert madman, who's clearly some sort of amalgam of Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein.
Yeah, that's true.
You get into the game, and now you're, as one helicopter, you're just taking on an entire military and wrecking it. And that can only make sense right after the first Persian Gulf War, where, the U.S.-led coalition just completely destroyed one of the largest armies on Earth in 2 or 3 days.
Yeah, they absolutely wrecked them.
So, I mean, you notice, like, right after that happens, a lot of games are obsessed with this idea of, one versus all.
Yeah.
And it's just this idea of American invincibility, especially.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, the idea of, like, the super soldier has become really, like, nowadays it's incredibly common. But back in the days of video games, video game protagonists weren't necessarily like these icons of invincibility. Even Mario is incredibly fragile. He dies in one hit. So the idea that you would have a bunch of video games that all come out and start to represent the soldier as like this impossible force multiplier, because like one helicopter is not gonna, like, I remember playing that game, like somehow you can like dodge around the missiles that are fired by the air defenses and like shoot them before they, like, come on guys. Realistically, you'd be flying in your helicopter, you'd get an alert, and then maybe you would either evade the missile or be taken out. You're counting on having many helicopters to actually do something, not just like one guy who somehow takes down the entire military.
Right. I mean, so it's sort of like this fantasy, but it also is based in, if you look at 80s action movies, stuff like Commando. So there's been a precedent for it, but I think in the 80s it was seen as just a fun fantasy, where you have Arnold Schwarzenegger, who also pretends to be an American, and then pretends to be a normal guy, and then wrecks the whole battalion by himself. I mean, it's sort of like haha, tongue-in-cheek type stuff. Then you get to the first Persian Gulf War, and people look at what happens live on CNN. They say, actually, maybe you could have just a handful of guys wreck an entire army. Yeah, maybe that's not ridiculous.
Yeah, and then obviously, the horrendous disaster that is the all the wars in the Middle East kind of proved that's not really the case. It turns out that actually, maybe defeating kind of a mad dictator is one thing, but engaging in a long-term sort of military project in a hostile country that is very easily, subject to guerrilla war is actually not, almost in a way, like, you can kind of get the impression that, like, to a person who grew up playing a game like Desert Strike, like, yeah, you're right. I think there is this kind of cultural idea that, oh yeah, we could win this war if we just had like a super soldier, who would go out there and like defeat all the guys and, I don't know, do like a sick 360 no scope with an Uzi or two Uzis.
Exactly. Then you got the well, I remember too as a kid, maybe this is partly because my dad was in the army at the time, but that sort of idea of American invincibility was, I think, prevalent from the first Gulf War until 9/11. And one of the ways that I remember that being the case is that if you went to a bookstore, say Books A Million, which is no longer around, or Barnes & Noble, whatever it might be, there'd always be a big table of books just about military equipment and how awesome it was. So just these big books of tanks and jets and different things. And, the whole premise is that, yeah, America has the best equipment and the Soviets have equipment and we fuck it up because the Soviets suck. Or then there'd be like some World War II books as well. But it was mostly just stuff about how great the U.S. military was.
Yeah.
And I noticed that things became a little more nuanced after 9/11 when we came back down to earth and realized actually in war a lot of people end up getting killed. It's not just one-sided ass kicking. And then before the first Gulf War, there were also things were usually more realistic. So I feel like there was almost a cash grab after the first Gulf War to sell to people this idea of our military is this invincible fighting machine, and here are all the tech specs of our machines.
Yeah, no, I think to some extent there is also maybe sort of this maybe hyperfixation on technology that also helped facilitate that kind of idea, because it wasn't just that, like, the American soldier was the most badass soldier, the most, like, the modern Spartan. It was also that they had the most advanced equipment in the world, like, oh yeah, look at everyone else is like a barbarian compared to us, we're the new Romans or whatever. And that's also possibly why they fixated on, like, technology, because also technology was becoming more accessible, and nothing quite says US military might as playing a video game where you're in the latest, I think by the time, military helicopter, gunning down literally hordes of enemies.
Yeah.
And
I think it was supposed to be like it kind of looked like an Apache, but I think it was supposed to be a souped up Apache. But anyway, it was just some super helicopter. I think in the sequels you get a stealth one.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Well, look, the genre that game is in, it's a shoot 'em up, right?
Yeah.
There is a certain sort of understanding that when you play in a genre like that, or at least you should, that, oh yeah, it's going to be you against like a horde of enemies, and a lot of the shoot 'em up games don't really have a story, because to have a story would be to acknowledge how crazy this whole premise is. But one of my favorite shoot 'em ups is a game called In the Hunt. I'm not sure if you've heard of it. I think it was also on the Sega.
I think that was a PlayStation and Saturn game, right? It's sort of a horizontal shooter.
Yeah, it was about being a submarine. And I really like that game because if you beat the game perfectly, so if you beat the game without losing a single life, you die at the end, which is kind of like this meta-commentary about, like, oh yeah, you were the invincible super soldier that single-handedly brought down this entire enemy army, and then, yeah, guess what, you died when their base exploded.
Wow.
It also, it had themes of climate change, because, like, the world was flooded, and, like, there was an evil corporation fighting over the remains of the earth. Except they deliberately caused the climate change. So that was just like, now that we're in the 2020s and we kind of really see the reality of sort of the climate action that's happening, it's less believable now that an evil company would just, because, like, back in the 80s, evil companies were doing all kinds of random nonsense. They would just drive a truck out to the middle of nowhere and dump, like, some glowing waste just because they could. Obviously, we know that they do that for cost-saving measures. But, like, it's never that blatant, it's never that, like, this cartoonishly evil. But games have that special quality, which is another reason why I think you're right, that gamers should at least be a little bit more open to understanding sort of the historical context of the games that we're in. Because, like, what would the historical context of a game made now be? Like, imagine you were, Thersites the Historian 2000, who was in the year 3000 looking back at, the games of now. Like, what would your understanding of the people of this era be from the games that we have today?
Well, I know from the Outer Worlds, if I were playing that 1,000 years from now, I'd get that a lot of people were trying their best not to work for corporate America. And that there were increasingly few opportunities to actually be independent from it. Because that's basically what the game is about. Everybody's miserable with their job. All the benefits and pay are all trash. People are unhealthy. The ecosystem is collapsing. So I think it's a pretty heavy-handed parody. But I imagine there are people who have played it who, either because they're on the younger side as gamers or because they don't pay a lot of attention to what occurs outside of their homes, they probably wouldn't pick up on a lot of it, even though I think it should be pretty obvious.
Yeah.
And if anything, I think giving somebody a copy of that game and then asking them what it's about is a good litmus test of whether they understand the basics of modern global politics or not.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you bring up the Outer Wilds, because that game was made by, I think it was like the people who made Fallout New Vegas, if I'm not mistaken. And,
Obsidian.
Yeah, Obsidian. And like New Vegas is one of my favorite games because it's the kind of game, and I don't like most of the other Fallout games. Again, popular, unpopular opinion, I like Fallout 1 and 2. I wish they kind of made more games like that. But that game has a lot to say about stuff. Now, I don't always agree with it. I think some of its statements are kind of either misinformed or maybe not exactly correct. But it has a lot to say about society and power. And that company, those guys, they were screwed over by Bethesda. So it doesn't surprise me that to a large degree, their next game, their next big game project would really be a game about like how corporations are evil. Even if they can't necessarily escape from the fact that they live in a society where corporations are kind of like the predominant, method of economic and arguably political, construction.
Yeah, and I think there's one of the endings you can get in that game where basically they just move to a more responsible corporate culture.
So I guess they elected like Joe Biden in the future.
Maybe, although I guess with him, maybe it's you elect somebody who promises to do something and then doesn't, or I don't know.
It's
Biden administration's pretty disappointing.
Yeah, we live in as Gandalf said, it's up to us to do with the times that we have, not to wish for better times. I think it's really interesting that you bring up the Outer Wilds, because like the other game that I think is very aesthetically kind of related, but doesn't really hit those same notes, is like Borderlands. Because let's hypothetically, to extend our thought experiment, Thersites 2000, gets both a copy of Borderlands and also the Outer Wilds and gives them to a person to play. I think if that person played Borderlands, I think they would come away with a very sort of a very sort of skewed perspective, because I think in Borderlands you have this whole, corporations are ruining everything, but the problem with the corporations really just seems to be that all the wrong people are in charge in that game, because for a lot of the issues that are in Borderlands, a lot of them are just the humanity is kind of irredeemably evil in that game. All of the crazy people who get put into positions of power, they don't really stop to think, wait a minute, is the corporation itself, should we do something about that? The Outer Wilds. Wait. There's another game that's called something very similar.
Yeah, there's Outer Wilds and then there's Outer Worlds, but I've never played Outer Wilds. Only
I played that game, and that one is also quite. I don't know if you might like it because it's been described as like a walking simulator, but it's actually quite an intense puzzle game. It's about it's about a future society dealing with like the destruction of the universe, space mystery, but yeah, the outer worlds, that's what it's called. I always get those two confused.
They came out the same year.
Yeah, they came out this. They have two similar. They have two very similar sounding names. But yeah, I think it's important to, obviously I don't want to come off as a curmudgeon, because I think that to some extent every generation is going to have this issue, right? People who are before us, obviously they're going to talk about how like their movie culture was better than ours. I don't know if that's true or not, but definitely they make those arguments, and we can make these arguments about video games. But I do think there is a more perfidious aspect to that, in the sense that video games are also, by virtue of their medium, uniquely monetizable, right? I do think that if you tried to sell DLC for a movie, I don't think that would fly.
Exactly, yeah, I think you're right. Whereas,
when it comes to video games, DLC is kind of the norm now. It's kind of expected that a game is going to launch, it's going to be incomplete or buggy, and it's going to need like a whole bunch of patches, day one patches, or there's going to have to be like a separate roadmap, because the game is not going to come out complete. And I feel like that kind of understanding really is not prevalent in other media. Although, who knows, maybe other media will take the worst examples from the gaming industry and run with it. And maybe we will see movies that have, DLC where you have to like pay to unlock a different ending or something. And that would just be, terrible.
Yeah. No, it would suck. I was also thinking, how would you do that with books? So the DLC equivalent would be as if you had to buy DLC to get, say, the epilogue of the book, or the introduction, or the table of contents, the index, the appendices.
Well, if you really think about it, you could just sell each chapter. Like, how there's episodic video games, or at least it used to be a thing. It was like, oh, you buy chapter 1, and then you buy. Hypothetically, nothing could stop you from doing that with a book, except for the fact that I think that if you started to do that, there's a significant chunk of the book buying public that would, I think, stop reading altogether. They would just stop reading. I think
you're right.
Maybe it's because, like, here I've been wanting to ask you about this. Like, gaming is a very new genre, and gaming, maybe in some regard, has had its initial early adopters. They were always people that were on the fringes of society. They were always marginalized. Anyone who's at least significantly old will remember a time when gamers were the active derision of everyone. If you wanted to have a character in a movie or something, you would make that person a gamer to show that they were irresponsible or immature, or not that gamers aren't these things nowadays, but like it was the stereotype, right? But nowadays gaming is much more normalized. But at the same time, the gaming audience hasn't really still gotten like acceptance in the way that things like film and movies have. And I have to wonder if that sort of marginalization in a way has made it that while games are making the most money out of anything, it's still not really respectable, or it's not seen in the same way. You know what I mean?
Right. I think a lot of what makes an art form, I guess, prestigious, a lot of times is just the age of it. How many generations have been able to experience this factor. So I think in that sense, gaming, there are certain people who will never accept gaming as a form of art.
Yeah, that's
no matter how good it gets.
Those people are wrong, but anyway.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just like there are people who would say that similar things about film. I saw some debate the other day between, it was two right-wingers, Milo Yiannopoulos and then some other guy. And basically, they were debating as to whether, say, anime could qualify as art on the same level as opera. And then, or something along those lines. Then Milo was putting the guy down for saying that Kurosawa films are artistic. He was saying, no, the only things that are truly artistic are... Then he was naming a very narrow selection of sort of like classically European things. So it was a weirdly elitist debate, but both of them came off horribly in it, because Milo came off as a snob who was completely out of touch. He was talking about just the food at this restaurant in Paris is so amazing. I make a point to go there every single year to eat at least one meal, because I guess it's just a rich guy's perspective. You can afford to do an entire trip to France to take a meal. And then the other guy was basically like, I'd just rather eat McDonald's here in Kentucky. So both of them came across as complete assholes, just for very different reasons.
Oh, that is hilarious. No, but I do think you're right. I know that when film came around, like a lot of the early history around film is, of course, a marginalization of sorts. Because film has to earn its credit. It has to earn being respected as an art form. Almost in a way, I have to wonder if the same thing happened, and you know more about ancient history than I do, about like novels, and the idea of like making a novel probably had to earn acceptance in the public. But I do have to wonder if eventually, gaming will get that sort of recognition, but by the time it gets that recognition, it will have been commodified so heavily, that the merits of gaming as an art form, I think, would have been undermined, because I feel like movies and books still have they still have a separation between themselves and capitalism in a way where if I wanted to give someone an example of corporate excess, of capitalism working as intended, I would talk to them about the gaming industry, right? If I wanted to be relatable, about how, everyone is crunched, there's mass layoffs, retrenchments, but the companies make record profits. There's horrible abuse that gets covered up, of the employees because the management are completely uninterested in fixing their toxic work culture. In many cases, they're completely complicit, like with Ubisoft. And I don't know if that's really because I think people still think of other mediums in a different way. Maybe that's just me.
No, I think you're right, and I think. Also, to the point about games being more commodified, I think that will very much impede their acceptance as art. Because it's kind of hard to see something as artistic if it's constantly asking you for money. And if there's a pay-to-play mechanic. I mean, it's like Call of Duty these days. But also, to an even greater extent, things like NBA 2K. The best players, quote-unquote, are the guys who have spent the most money on the game to unlock all the cool shit. I mean, there's like that one adaptation you can get in Call of Duty where when you press aim, it automatically aims at the other player's head. So when you're rounding a corner, they can just snap off an accurate shot. Whereas if you haven't bought all that crap, you can't do that.
Yeah, or you just have to be, preternaturally good at the game.
Yeah, I mean, but at a certain point, there's only so good you can be unless you have all these
pieces of equipment. And I mean, I don't have the best reflexes in the world, so as someone without all the fancy equipment, I just basically get chewed to pieces. And then I'll often get angry messages like, man, you fucking suck.
I don't play online games for that reason. I'm not that good at them. I just want to, because the funny thing is I will play games on hard, because I played all the Halo games on like Legendary, right? And I had a lot of fun doing it. But if I go into a lobby and I start playing with people, I'm going to suck. And there are a lot of reasons for that. I'm getting older. My reflexes are going to get slower eventually, right? I can't devote all my time to playing like a 14-year-old kid could, today. So that's definitely one thing. But on the other hand, I don't know. I just get a lot of anxiety, because I feel like I'm under pressure to perform. I have to not let my team down. I have to not let, all this time that I'm spending online. Whereas I feel like if I play the game, I can at least say to myself, okay, well, I might be getting killed like by every second, elite or brute or whatever. But at least I'm experiencing the story, and when I've experienced the story, I can put the game down and I, don't have to really, do anything with it. But with an online game, it feels like I'm spending this time, I've got to justify it, I've got to get good at it. And that's a very harsh mindset, because you don't really do that in other stuff, You're not like, I have to get really good at looking at this painting, or I have to get really good at, reading the book.
Right.
You can just read the book and look at the painting, or listen to the music, It's only if you are the artist in those cases, like, oh yeah, I have to get better at painting. But when you're playing a video game, you're not the guy making the game, You are the audience for that game. You're not the artist. I know some people kind of say like, okay, well, in some games, maybe you are the artist. But nah, you're choosing to experience the story in different ways. You're not really making the story actively,
I mean, and I guess that kind of works, especially with a lot of shooters, because normally the character that you play is a guy who was on a mission. You're your whole mission parameters are defined by somebody else. You're there to execute a mission and leave. And I guess that's kind of how games work in general, is that someone else sets up the story, sets up the world, establishes the mechanics, and then you're there to take a ride and leave. So in many ways, I think as an analogy, it works pretty easily.
However, to counterpoint that, speaking about how the gaming industry is a sort of a metaphor of capitalism, also that pay-to-win stuff, that 100% clarifies the idea of like, oh yeah, you have all the money because your dad had all the money and you can just buy all the advantages in life. That I find makes very clear sort of the nature of like differences between wealth, between people. Like, oh yeah, it might be hard for someone to be like, well, Jeff Bezos earned his money, but then it's like, okay, well, wait a minute. That guy who's just kicking my ass in Call of Duty, he just bought all of the advantages that I could never possibly get to, That's a pretty sort of clarifying thing. But I wanted to point out, like, do you know what a live service game is? Right? Do you know that term?
Not quite, no. What does it mean?
Yeah, so other shout out for the channel, we did an episode on that. So live services are games that are essentially experiences sold in perpetuity. The idea is that you are playing a continuous service of a game. You're not buying a product that has a start point and an end point. You are playing a continuous service for the game that is going to be continuously supported with new content for you to continuously keep playing. Have you heard of the game Destiny?
Yeah.
That's a live service game. The assumption is that the gamer will continuously be playing the product. There is no endpoint in mind, and it can branch off not just like an MMO, because an MMO in some respects is a live service game, right? You always get more content out of it. But the difference is that this can be applied to anything. So, for example, are you familiar with any of the Tom Clancy games?
Tom Clancy games, yeah, I've played a couple of them. I have some. I haven't played most of them though.
We, as an aside, as someone who knows about military history, maybe we could do an episode of talking about them in particular, because they're wild in terms of their presentation of America and American military, policy and stuff like that. But like the Tom Clancy games, the Ghost Recons and stuff like that, they're live service games. They are designed specifically for continuous content releases, right? And the idea is that you will have to be continuously paying for this product and paying for it. And that's it. That's how the game is designed to be played, as a continuous payment, drip feed content kind of thing. And that is antithetical, actually, to my understanding of a video game, which is that it is a product, it's complete, there's a start point and an end point. And a lot of these games are touted as being forever and forever, but they rarely last long because it's just not sustainable, right? Anthem was dead on arrival, basically, if you've heard about that game. BioWare game that was very, very bad. And so yeah,
the one that they developed in lieu of a newer and better Mass Effect.
Yeah, they canned that one for a game that was dead on arrival. But yeah, that's the live service model. I think challenges our idea of about media and about games as art, and also games kind of as a history, because like a live service game is theoretically meant to go on forever, and they're sold as products that will go on forever. But very quickly, all of these games are made to extract money from people. They're made to be much more grindy. They're made to be much more repetitive. And so they don't actually have a very long stay time because they burn people out. And most of the people who play them are people who already spent a lot of money on them. And so there's kind of a sunk cost fallacy kind of thing going on there.
Right.
Yeah,
I guess when it comes to the live game thing, I guess that's probably not something I'll ever get into. I mean, ideally with me, when I play games, I actually do like the fact that they end. And part of that's because not only are there so many other games I could be playing, but I have other hobbies too, and I just like to experience something, enjoy it, and then move on. So like things like World of Warcraft and other things are things I've never experienced and I just have no interest in. Yeah,
I play games as an escape, from maybe stresses of life and stuff like that. So the idea that my job a game could become a job, like some noted examples of like live service games might be stuff like Fortnite. Fortnite is a live service game. They're going to keep making that game until they can wring every lost cent out of it. But there's no endpoint, is there? Right? For a kind of game like that, they're going to keep making crossovers with every property until eventually, I don't know, there's just like a smorgasbord of color that's just like exploding in your face all the time.
Yeah.
Custom skin. Fun fact, another aside, but like, there's I read an article about how in Fortnite, if you can't afford to have any of like the custom skins, other gamers will use, I guess, what might be described as a slur, but it's really just an insult. They'll call you a default because you use the default skins because you're not paying money for the stuff. It's like, okay, so that has become so normalized in that game's culture that it's expected that you will pay money for a thing that in previous years and previous decades would have just been given to you for free,
Right.
And that, I think, is a very harmful attitude to have.
Well, that and I mean, if you are going to spend money on games, I think that gamers definitely owe it to the creators that they claim to honor to make sure that the companies they're giving money to treat their designers and developers respectfully. Because I have met, say, going to GameStops to look for games, I have met a lot of the people in there who do programming on the side.
Mm.
And they're clearly not doing well because they are working at a fucking GameStop.
Yeah.
So they are doing things that are useful and productive for games people enjoy, and yet they're probably not making much of a living. They might not have benefits. They're probably living in poverty, have very low quality of life, not a lot of leisure. So again, like if you're going to spend money on games, I think that it would behoove people to only spend that kind of extra money on companies which are known to give their employees a decent living.
Yeah,
and to share profits.
Yeah, I one of my favorite games, Dead Cells, is made by an anarcho-syndicalist game studio. So they're a worker cooperative, I think. But I totally agree with you. I think gamers tend to be very conservative, or at least very reactionary, and part of the problem is that they don't really have any lens of analysis for kind of understanding the industry. And so it's very easy to trick them on very kind of easy things. It's very easy to trick them. Oh yeah, the game is bad, or games are bad because, I don't know, the main character is a woman now or whatever. When it's like, oh, wait a minute, the company that makes this game is exploiting its workers and it's producing this terrible toxic culture and it's crunching them, and they have no job security or whatever. And it's very hard to get through to them on that because it's become so normalized that this is just the way that that the games industry is. I know people who are like, oh, I wanted to become a game developer. And if I talk to the people that actually made it, they're like, I wish I didn't want to be a game developer, because it's like the industry will just take you and spit you up and chew you out. So that's why on this channel we always advocate for the formation of developer unions. I feel like if game developers were unionized and there were like large industry-wide unions, we could really get some major pushback on sort of corporate power, because game developers are very specialized people, and the company will be literally dead on arrival if they don't have game developers. If the union is like, we're going to delay the next content patch, the company is going to start doing things because gamers are going to be angry. They're going to get upset at that. And I feel like there's a unique way in which advocacy for labor rights could be pushed forward, is by advocating.
Yeah, and I mean, it is a dark sign that when you have a group of intelligent, skilled laborers like developers, and they aren't being properly represented or treated, that means that there's something wrong with that industry, and it's indicative of a much broader problem with labor relations. Because even, I mean, I'd say most of from the late 19th century forward, if you are a skilled laborer, for the most part, that skill will ensure that your employer treats you with a certain amount of respect. So the fact that that's not the case in the game industry means that it actually is worse off than a whole lot of other industries, including manufacturing and...
Yeah. I think again, I think one of the big problems as to why it is that way is because the history of game development is passionate developers who are people who want to make games because that's their passion, right? They're deeply they're deeply motivated to make video games because they like playing video games. And, for them, working in the games industry is a dream job. And because it's a dream job, it's an excuse by the companies to abuse them, right? Because, what are you going to do? Are you going to go work at a bank? No, you want to work at Ubisoft. You want to work at Activision. You want to work at, these big companies. And therefore, we're going to abuse you, and you're going to take it because you don't have any power. Again, this is where I think unionization could work, because you're right, these people are very skilled. A lot of them are particularly, talented individuals, or just, the field as a whole, I think, is full of great talent. And these people should, in a Marxian sense, I guess they would be part of like the labor aristocracy, because they'd be in a similar vein to like doctors and lawyers and, those kinds of people. But they're not. In many cases, they aren't actually. They're much closer to being impoverished than they are to actually being, middle class. And yeah, it is a deep malaise. But again, I feel like video games are the indicator of sort of the state of capitalism as it is right now. Because even in an industry that makes hand over fist profits every year, it's a record layoffs, lots of crunch, consumer satisfaction is at an all-time low. It's a microcosm, I think, of the wider sort of failures of the capitalist engine in that kind of way.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It is a good microcosm for the whole of the current state of capitalism.
Yeah, because only in an industry like video games could you have continuously this cycle of like every game has to make more money than the game that came before it. One of my favorite game franchises, Dead Space. I'm not sure if you've played it. Dead Space was never ever going to be a multi-billion-dollar franchise because it's A, a horror game, and B, kind of a niche horror game. It was its own franchise that came out. They were never ever going to be able to sell, the amount of money that EA would justify for making more of the games. And so obviously, the franchise was killed prematurely. But, in a better world, maybe you would have the ability to make those kinds of games without necessarily having them to make all the money in the world. Because I think another problem is that because video games, the gaming industry has kind of been like a money printer in a way, because this is back like in the pre-video game crash days, when companies like Atari were like, oh yeah, we'll just do it, and we'll just make like all the money in the world. We'll just like do 80s guys, do a bunch of cocaine and then just like put all the money into video games, and it would just like continue to rise. I feel like a big part of this issue is that for the most part, games are still incredibly profitable. They are the most profitable media to make. They beat movies, they beat books, they beat everything basically because they just make so much money, and those financial incentives are so hard to shake off.
Yeah, no, I think you're right.
Yeah, it's a unique problem, I think, to the gaming industry, because I don't know what the movie industry would be like if movies were as profitable per investment as games are.
Well, I mean, I guess at one point movies were more profitable than they are now, because it used to be the standard go-to money laundering operation for a lot of crime families. That's where a lot of really bad movies, especially from, I don't know, the 50s, 60s, 70s came from, would just be that, a family would have some money they'd like to launder, and they would just hire some director off the streets and let him make some passion project. And sometimes they'd turn out brilliant, other times it'd be a piece of shit. Didn't really matter to the family, though.
Yeah, I have this funny thought in my head of like an old mafia boss trying to like launder money within an Avengers movie.
Yes, imagine they would work through a middleman who would then go and give the money, but I can only imagine like some, hardened Don type listening to a movie pitch for an art film, and they'd be like, whatever, just go, whatever, just go do it. Sounds great, kid.
Yeah,
and they'd ask him later, "What did you understand what that guy was talking about?" Not a word.
Yeah, he just gave us the money. Let's just do it, or they'll bust all our kneecaps. That's really funny because I feel almost in a way that maybe video games could be like money laundering of some respects, but I also just think that the industry itself is uniquely profitable because the game is a thing that is consumed in a different kind of way. You can't just watch like a 5-minute movie, really. You can play a game for 5 minutes. There are plenty of games that are designed to be played on your phone. And their ubiquity in our society has really transformed the way we engage with media. Because like who are the most popular people, or at least they used to be the most popular people on YouTube? It's all people who are making gaming content. It's all people who are reacting to video games or doing let's plays of video games. and guys like PewDiePie, Markiplier, Jacksepticeye, those guys, they built like a media empire of that, of video games, and now games are just everywhere.
Right. And yeah, no, that's true. And also, I mean, the gaming industry, there's no reason to think it won't continue to grow, because especially with the generations coming up now, Gen Z and Gen Alpha, I mean, the number of people in those generations who are gamers is becoming a very clear majority.
Yeah.
Even with millennials, I mean, I think it's at least half are gamers of some description or other.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's only going to continue to grow.
Yeah, a lot of people have talked about like, oh yeah, I think we did a video on this about like how back in the 80s or the 90s, with back when the video game crash happened, there was a lot of similar conditions, a lot of labor exploitation, a lot of like capitalist exploitation. Games were like a license to print money, and then the industry crashed. However, I actually disagree that another crash is going to be either possible or going to happen today. Because number one, games are a lot more integrated into society than they were previously. Number two, gaming is now a totally global phenomenon. One of the reasons why gaming was able to survive is because the industry crashed in the US, but like it didn't crash in Japan and it didn't crash in Europe. Now there's one global gaming world. So if any big company goes down, it will just make space for the other companies to rise up, The idea of all of the companies failing at the same time, which would constitute a systemic failure that I don't think it would be like if all the banks failed, It would be like that kind of situation, which I don't see that happening. I don't.
Yeah, I think it'd be less likely for all the gaming companies to fail at once, but also even if all the gaming companies did fail, the collapse would only last for a couple of years just because there'd be so much demand and you still have so many developers around. And not only that, but you also do have indie studios that could then potentially gain capital and become the big players. So, I mean, it would only last maybe 2 years at max if something were to happen.
No, you're totally right. I like indie games. I think most of the games that I play are indie games, but I think the big issue is just that like there is such a control over the scope of an indie game versus the scope, like even some of your biggest indie games are not going to get the same kind of reach and attention that like the next Call of Duty will get, by virtue of the fact that there is this combined enterprise that pushes these games into the media sphere. An indie developer like Toby Fox, the guy who made Undertale, he doesn't have the money to buy interviews, media attention, positive hype, all of these other kinds of things. He doesn't have no indie developer has the money to make the next Call of Duty, right? And so those games that exist, the indie games, they always exist in their own little niches. Another reason why I don't think the games industry will collapse is because even if there was some kind of massive systemic failure, the way that gaming is integrated into the society is that the demand for gaming will not decrease, right? I think something that is maybe a little bit not overstated, but talked about in the previous crash is that the demand for gaming actually kind of didn't exactly continue to rise necessarily, but I don't think anything is going to stop the demand for gaming now. I think people are still going to want to game, and invariably there will be. Also, I feel like a lot of companies are publishers, and publishers are not necessarily the same thing. They're not like all making their own games. They can just hire new studios, and it's much harder for a publisher to go down than for a studio to go down. And do you think the government would bail out a games company? I have to wonder.
Right now, I'd have to say no. I don't think they would. That being said, because I don't think game companies make very many campaign contributions, and that really determines who the government bails out.
It is funny that you mentioned this, because they do have lobbyists. They do have a lobby. Activision actually gets tax money from the U.S. taxpayer. They get a tax incentive. They actually get paid tax, I think. Not a lot of tax, but they actually do get paid tax because of the way that. So
that's gross.
Maybe, it's weird, right? A multi-billion-dollar company, and we gamers are the people who are paying they're not paying any taxes because they hide their money, but they're getting a tax rebate from the government. What? That doesn't make any sense. So I feel like
because I know the GE for several years got a tax rebate despite being one of the most profitable companies in the world.
Yeah,
General Electric.
Yeah, so I don't know, maybe because the other thing is games are not going to go away, and they're only going to get more integrated into our life. Like, I hate to think about this, but there is going to be a politician in my lifetime who's going to be like, "What's up, gamers? Let's do a political rally in Fortnite." And that's going to be a real thing. That's not going to
actually AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She and some other Congress people did some sort of streaming event on Twitch recently.
Yeah, they did. Was that you talking about when they played Among Us with the song?
I think so. Yeah. So I mean, that's starting to happen already. Exactly. I guess.
So once people realize, hey, wait a minute, games are like, another avenue that you can inject, sort of your tendrils of traditional control. Because people think the games industry is made of subversives. No, it isn't. It's made of the traditional, well-moneyed types who were just able to co-opt the system as it is. All of these executives, they're all from like the same moneyed classes. Very few of them are actually developers who started making games and then became part of the moneyed class. They're mostly just part of the moneyed class that bought into this thing. But I do think once games start to become more integrated into the way that people think of like everyday life, once esports becomes because if I tell someone who's my age that I watch esports, they might not know what that is, or they might laugh at it, but in a couple of years, maybe that might not be, maybe watching a virtual NBA might be as normalized as watching, say like the real NBA. And then at that point, then all bets are off. I feel like the lobbying class is just waiting for, because like the lobbyists are people from the system. So I feel like there's got to be like some gaming executives who are just like, itching to chomp at the bit, to get into that kind of discourse with the government, and start trading political favors for different kinds of things.
Yeah, I mean, I have noticed that the government is a lot less eager to take a bite out of the gaming industry or use them as a scapegoats. I mean, if you look at the early 90s here in the US, there were hearings about Doom and Mortal Kombat. It was part of the culture wars. But it wasn't a straight Democrat versus Republican thing, because there were a lot of more conservative Democrats who were on the side of let's chastise people for playing Doom. But anyway, it was very much just the culture war issue, though. I can't imagine it happening today, and a lot of it is because politicians can look at their demos and realize that they would offend a much broader swath of society, and that unlike in the early 90s when gamers were still mostly, as we mentioned before, people who were sort of on the margins, now it's such a mainstream thing that would be absolutely foolish politically to go after gamers in that way.
Yeah. The only time you would do that is if you were trying to like curry favor with the boomers, and that strategy is not going to work because they're all aging out. They're all eventually going to pass on, and you have to think about the future. And the future are the Zoomers, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, those guys, gals and pals. They're all going to know more about video games. They're all going to want to care more about video games. And if you are a politician, who's trying to appeal to them, you have to do it on their terms. And I do think that people will start to do more political stuff with video games, and I do feel like that will eventually filter into sort of establishing the relationship between the gaming industry. Because the one thing that the gaming industry is very good at is dodging regulation, right? Loot boxes in video games is gambling. That should be regulated, by in any sane society, that would be regulated just like gambling is, but it isn't. And that's because the games industry is very good at A, preventing people from caring about it, B, hiding the issue from the public, and C, somehow avoiding, they somehow avoid like major political action that gets taken against them, I think only a few countries have actually, I think Belgium actually has it so that loot boxes are banned, or at least regulated. And it's that would be an easy thing to do. But it seems like there is a shadow of like that political, issue coming in there where the games industry don't want to be regulated. And if you try to regulate them, then I think they might start flexing some of their financial muscle, to, counteract that kind of impulse.
I mean, and also every time there's a mass shooting, at least for a while, people would start talking about, well, what about violent video games?
For the one that happened, I think that was in Michigan, the recent one, or was that Florida? I don't know. America has a lot of mass
I don't know.
shootings.
There's so many. I can't keep track of them.
But there was one where it was like, the news were like, oh yeah, he played Fallout 4. And they were like, what? Come on,
Yeah,
guys.
because every time I hear that kind of stuff, I'm like, yeah, Fallout 4, though, I mean, it makes you make moral decisions. That's not a good example.
Yeah,
Anybody who knows what Fallout is would laugh at that.
yeah, and increasingly there will be a part of the electorate where that will just absolutely not work on them, because they'll be like, I know what Fallout is. That's not a game that's just like, Postal or whatever.
Yeah, or, I mean, I remember there was also a big movement, especially by CNN, to really try to attack gaming YouTubers and try to paint them to be way worse than they were. Remember, there was an effort to try to paint PewDiePie as a Nazi sympathizer at one point because he made a joke.
Yeah, he's just an edgelord. I don't think. He's
just an edgy guy who does pranks as well as his game commentaries. So I mean, they didn't really have much to go on. And anybody who's even watched, because I'm not a big fan of a lot of those guys. I've only ever watched like one PewDiePie video, start to finish. But even I laughed at that when I heard that story. I'm like, no.
I think it's just an impulse from maybe an establishment that's not exactly comfortable with gaming as of yet, and so it tries to use, because they're a convenient scapegoat, right? Like, wouldn't it be super convenient for the NRA and all these other groups that, oh yeah, it's not like lax gun regulations or America's gun culture. Those are the reasons why, Americans commit mass shootings at disproportionate rates to other countries. It's violent video games, and I'm pretty sure they've got like Doom and stuff in other developed countries, and they don't have the same problem. But yeah, this has been a really interesting conversation. I think we've diverged a little bit from the original impulse to kind of just talking about sort of like games in society. But this is kind of why we do this podcast, so that we can have these kinds of conversations. Is there any final closing thought you'd like to talk about?
Not especially. I can't really think of anything right offhand.
Well, I think we did the topic justice. I think that if we want the audience to take away any particular message, it's that you should think about your games. You should think about them in a variety of different contexts, and you should try to understand what the games are telling you about the society that you're in. It's quite telling that a lot more games of late have been making anti-capitalist or environmentalist messages, right? Because that is a sign that things are changing in your society, and you should be aware of that. Okay, I think you can shout yourself out. I will include a link. Obviously, the link to his channel will be in the description of the video. But yeah, shout yourself out.
Yeah, I guess just to recapitulate one of the points from earlier before I do that. So if you were to compare sort of the central message of, say, The Outer Worlds, which is made in 2019, to the Joker, or is it just Joker? I can never remember.
I think it's just
the
Joker.
Central message there. And then you also have the one film of the year from South Korea, which was actually very similar thematically to Joker. Parasite. So if you compare those three works, which are all works of art reflecting the contemporary world, I mean, only Parasite did it explicitly, where it's set in the present. But if you compare the basic themes and complaints, you see a lot of alignment there. Mm-hmm. Now, they sort of look at different parts of the problem, since the character from Joker is much more, I guess, lower class, whereas a lot of the people in Outer Worlds are supposed to be sort of the middle manager types in corporate America. But still, you do see a lot of complaints about capitalism in the present. So I think, if you were looking back and, as you said, from the year 3000, and you only had these three pieces of media from 2019, you could see that there's a lot of discontentment with contemporary practice. And that's more the general point that I often try to make about how games do encapsulate and very much capture the spirit of the time that they were made and the concerns of the developers more specifically.
Yeah, I would say so, because games are art, and artists make art from their time. So that definitely tracks. I did want to say we did actually do an episode on Parasite. So if you want to talk more about that, I think I'm well versed on it.
Okay. All right. Yeah, it's been a little while since I've seen it, but it is an excellent movie, though.
Yeah, we did one. I did one with a friend of mine who lived in Korea We did one on Parasite, and we also did one on Squid Game.
That's a good one too. I love that show.
Yeah, one day there's gonna be a Squid Game like VR game. I guarantee you that. All right, so I've been Emilio, and
I'm Thersites the Historian.
Thersites the Historian. Have a nice day, everyone. Take care, and good night.